Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Ask Professor Paranormal. I am Lloyd Arbeck, your host and guide, and I see a bunch of folks here. I hope you're all doing well, and welcome to the 1st of October. It's Halloween month, of course, the time when everybody gets spooky towards the end of the month. I'm expecting, well, I'm already seeing a lot of stuff on the streaming services focused on horror and ghost hunting and things like that. It's just unfortunate that so much of it is on the negative side, I think. So, so hi to my folks who are here. It's good to have you here. Um, I want to start by talking about an organization that could use everybody's help, and that's the Parapsychology Foundation. It's simply parapsychology.org. They are about to pretty much shutting down unless we can help them, and the Rhine Center is actually going to be supporting them a little bit. But this is the Parapsychology Foundation was started back in the 1950s by a medium by the name of Eileen Garrett. And Garrett was one of the better evidential mediums of her time. She was tested, researched, never really attacked by the skeptics, which is pretty interesting. And she founded this organization as an educational organization to really reach out to the public. For a while, they published a magazine called Tomorrow, which was a digest type magazine, had a lot of great stuff in it. I found some old used copies of it, which was really excellent. They published something called Parapsychology Review for a while, and actually published a number of books, which you can still purchase on their website at this point. But they've had dwindling finances over the years. Partly, they've given out grants to students and researchers. And these days, they actually had unfortunate closure of their library due to the landlord deciding to sell the building. And they had no place to put it. So it's going to the University of Maryland. That's where it'll be hosted. However, the organization, which is guided by Lisette Coley, who is the granddaughter of Eileen Garrett, would really like to continue. And we're trying to help them kind of continue even limping along. So please do go to parapsychology.org, connect with them on Facebook. They've been putting up a lot of video of past conferences on YouTube. So they have a YouTube channel. Whatever you can do to help out, that would be great. So I just wanted to mention that. Also, something I'll mention again later on is that the classes for the Rhine Center are starting up next week, starting a week from tomorrow. And they include a course, which is an introduction to parapsychology, taught by one of my former students, Jimmy Akin, who has his own podcast called Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, which is a great podcast. He's very, very informed, interesting, definitely somebody you should pay attention to. He'll be teaching the Introduction to Parapsychology course, which will be starting next Monday, later in the day, in the afternoon, West Coast time, early evening, East Coast time. And then I will be teaching my course, which is an advanced field investigations class. Think of it as Ghost Hunting Part 2 for that. That's happening next Monday. A week from Wednesday, I'll be starting my Paranormal Case Studies course, which will be looking at a few specific seminal cases in parapsychology research, such as the 1958 poltergeist case on Long Island, the Popper poltergeist case in Seaford, Long Island. That's kind of an important case for us. And I'll be doing a deep dive into that one. I'll be doing a deep dive into a reincarnation case that Ian Stevenson had. I'll be doing a deeper dive into some of the surveys that have yielded us a lot of really great information, mainly the Census for Hallucinations and a deep survey done in Charlottesville, Virginia, back in the 1970s. And then for many of the weeks, I'll be doing a very deep dive into a number of my own cases in ways that outside of this class I've never done. So I hope you'll look for that. There are a couple of other classes you might find interesting, and that's the Rhine Education Center, or just simply rhine.org if you want to get there. So rhineedu.org or just rhine.org, clicking on the education button. I know that most of you who are here already, whose names I recognize, I think you know about these classes already. So let's see where we are this week. Anybody have anything they want to bring up? I know Patrick mentioned he had just been in Hawaii and had gone on my buddy Lapaka Kapanui's tour on Oahu. Lapaka is a really interesting guy and really heavily into the folklore and the history of Hawaii and the paranormal there. So if anybody goes out there, and there's Jimmy Aiken popping up. All right. Oh, Nandor Fodor and the Talking Mongoose. So Jimmy, I have to ask, give it a thumbs up or thumbs down? I've heard mixed things about that movie quite a bit, actually. For those of you who don't know, the movie stars Simon Pegg. It's, I assume it's a comedy to some extent, but it covers the case of Jeff, starting with a G. Jeff, the talking mongoose, was reported from the Isle of Man back in the 30s and 40s. And let's see, Jimmy saying, appreciated how much the movie included accurate details in the first part, was wondering what our thoughts of. All right, I will have to see the movie. Now that it's available, I'll definitely go see the movie. Or at least I'll pull it up on Amazon. I've been waiting for it. It hasn't been playing in any theaters here. All right, Jimmy's asking, did Jeff have have info about Fodor's father? That's a good question. I got a couple of books, one in-depth book about it. I wasn't that informed about the case, but knowing the movie came out, I did pick up something to look at it more deeply. The case was investigated also by Harry Price, the very famous ghost hunter back then. Fodor, I've certainly read a lot of Fodor stuff. I'm trying to remember. He didn't really write much about that case himself. I'll have to go back through his books. It's been quite a long time since I looked at the books of his that I have, but pretty interesting. All right. Okay, and thank you, Jimmy, for that. I'll take a look and see what I can find in my Fodor material. Maybe I'll contact the person I know for the Fodor family and see what we can find out about it as well. There's also a couple movies about Harry Price, or with Harry Price as the main character there. And I just saw something, I think it's Apple TV, has got a docuseries coming up about the Enfield poltergeist very soon, using some of the audio recordings. So it's dramatization, but they are going to be using some of the audio recordings from the famous Enfield case. So I think our history is starting to surface in other ways now. I'm assuming they got those recordings from the estate of either Guy Lyon Playfair or Maurice Grosse as well. One of the Harry Price movies I saw is pretty fascinating. I mean, some of them, they're all period pieces, of course. So worth definitely watching at this point. I probably will not be watching most of the horror movies that are coming out. I'm not really a big fan of horror films as they stand today in general. I know there's a new Exorcist movie coming out. I won't be seeing that. Certainly not in the theater. If I'm going to go to the theater these days, it's for other things at this point. Okay. Remember, Enfield is being debunked. Not debunked. I mean, it's okay. So it's one thing to say that the skeptics have taken pot shots at it. If it's debunked, that has to mean that it was completely shown to be fraud. Fraud and not misinterpretation. But having spoken once at length years and years ago to Maurice Grosse about it, he was convinced there was real phenomena going on. We do have in poltergeist cases, and in many of the cases, we do sometimes have what's called imitative fraud. And that happens for good psychological reasons, actually. I mean, in poltergeist cases, you've got a living person, of course, creating or causing this. And even in non-poltergeist cases, there could be situations in which one of the family members, usually it's a kid, is finally able to act out physically in ways that they couldn't do otherwise, because anything they do, as long as they're not seen doing it, they are not blamed. I mean, what's going to happen is people are suspecting the ghost or the poltergeist for doing it. So I think it was 14% of cases that Bill Roll and others had over the years, there was some amount of imitative fraud, even in those cases that pretty clearly had real phenomena as well. In a couple of my cases, well after the fact, even though it would be challenging for the person for the poltergeist agent, who later on said that they faked it because they didn't want any attention on it. That's what we found out. It had been really hard for them to do it given the circumstances and what was actually going on. Something I'll be talking about in my class, my paranormal case studies class, as a matter of fact. All right, Patrick, you haven't seen The First Exorcist? I kind of laughed my way through that one, partly because I had read a full backup of all the special effects in it, and they weren't very good, actually, when it came right down to it. Okay, Ghost of the Chelsea Hotel documentary is mostly about the history and notable residents. They did include a few minutes of haunting. Okay, you know, that's I think that whenever you look at a haunted place, you do need to know something about the history, especially if they're going to go into a connection between a supposed ghost and a place's history. So you have to have that historical know-how. I guess if there's not enough ghost content, they're going to focus on the history, of course, especially if it's a challenged history. If there's been something going on there that was, you know, kind of violent or anything like that. Wait a minute. White Noise is a great movie. Are you talking about the one that came out years ago? Really? You thought White Noise? I thought that movie was actually, I mean, as a movie, of course it wasn't even accurate, but for as far as EVP goes or ITC, but as a movie, it had a terrible ending. It just was not well written, at least not the ending. Okay, Greg, yeah, Demons and Saviors on Hulu is about the Christina Boyer case, which she was known as Tina Resch back when she was the Columbus poltergeist. This was a well-publicized case, publicized in a way that the family really was not happy about. Some reporters got hold of it. People descended on the location in Columbus, Ohio. It was a teenage girl, poltergeist activity. And she was fostered. She was adopted. The documentary is mainly about her legal case, which I'll get to in a moment. But unfortunately, the documentary takes a negative view of Roll and makes some accusations in it, or infers some accusations that are actually absolutely untrue. I've talked to Bill's daughter, talked to Bill's son, and actually not too long ago when the documentary first came out. And I've talked to people who actually hosted Tina in Durham and Chapel Hill when Bill worked with her because she came from Columbus. She came over to the East Coast to be studied, to kind of work with Bill, to kind of deal with her phenomena and such. And he witnessed, and others witnessed, actual activity. From what Bill's son and other people have told me, Bill sent her money, and the accusation was Bill did write a book, co-authored a book about the case. It didn't do great. I mean, it wasn't like it was a bestseller or anything like that. But Bill did send money to Tina for her legal defense, because what the documentary is about is she's in jail because she plea bargained. Her daughter died, and there were signs of abuse. But she was not even there when the daughter died. Her boyfriend was. He got off with some sort of deal. She did not. And the documentary is there to try to get support to get her out of prison, because there's so much evidence that was not considered, including her alibi at that point. So that's what that's about. Let's see here. What do you think of physical mediumship, particularly materialization, ectoplasm? I have no doubt that in the history of physical mediumship, especially back when it was in the light, there was some activity that was psychokinetic in nature. Whether it was caused by spirits or by the mediums themselves, hard to say, because it's so different, and there's very infrequently really good information, that the kind of evidence we get of contact with spirits with mental mediums, we don't see that typically. There's only a few cases from the early days where it seems that ectoplasm might have been real, and those are circumstances in which the researcher touched the ectoplasm and it dissolved in their, it just simply went away. In other circumstances, there's just been so many instances of fraud. And the biggest issue of physical mediumship today, whether it's fraud or not, we can't say what's going on for sure, because these are done in complete darkness with really no access to even infrared night shot, because the mediums claim or believe, and this is the problem, we don't know whether it's truly a sincere belief or not, that infrared light will affect the spirit process, including the development of ectoplasm. And yet, ectoplasm will often show up in these spirit mediumship situations, the physical mediumship situations, in red light, which puts off more infrared. That light bulb puts off more infrared, that's heat activity, than the spotlight on a night shot camera. So there's some issues there, unfortunately. Quite a number of issues there. So I'm not convinced about physical mediumship. I sat through one session with a medium named Kai Mugi. I'm convinced that at least some of the things were fraudulent because, well, pretty clearly were. At the other end of the things, there were some things that happened that might or might not have been PK. The ectoplasm piece that I saw was unconvincing for a number of reasons. So that's a different situation. Not terribly convincing. I think the most convincing case of physical mediumship probably is the Skoll Group's research over in the UK. All right, Paul is saying, I know the Amityville case wasn't real, although he saw a Chicago ghost hunter named Norm Bassel who showed pictures of the house that was apparently had ghostly images. Yeah, I don't buy it. There are a number of reasons why I don't buy it. The information we have on the Amityville house and the haunting, the case itself as reported in the book, in the media, doesn't fit for so many reasons, has too many contradictions, but it's not unlikely. And you know, I know one of the Lutz kids have, at least one of them has talked about experiences he had in the 4 weeks that they were in that house. And I have no doubt that they picked up on the emotions, the terror, the fear of the family who was shot by Ron DeFeo, picked up on the actual murders, which is technically a haunting. But all the stuff that was reported in the book, in the media, I don't buy that. And I also don't buy, that, the fact is that the next family that moved in had no problems with the house whatsoever. Alex Tennis and Dr. Carlos Osas investigated the house for the American Society for Psychical Research. Alex was a psychic who did work quite a bit with law enforcement. He picked up on images, mental images of and feelings of the murders. And he also found a book contract. So that's pretty much actually all I can say about it at this point. The ghostly images thing, I really don't buy. Okay. All right. That was a little bit of a information spurt right there. Of course, we're going to have all sorts of these past hauntings dredged up during this month because it is, of course, Halloween month. And in fact, I'll be speaking at the USS Hornet on, they're having an evening of spirits called Ship of Spirits on October 27th. It's Friday night. I'll be talking about my investigation of the Hornet, which is far from a scary haunting at all. It might have been unnerving for a lot of women in the past because I don't know that this is still happening, but initially there were a lot of women who were aboard the ship during the day, by the way, who had themselves goosed apparently by the sailors, the ghosts of the sailors. So that was a pretty common thing that was happening back then. But to my knowledge, there's not been anything negative other than a couple times that we feel like they needed, the ghosts needed to have meetings and they didn't want people around. Okay, near infrared actually complements if not enhances PK power in your experience. I'd be curious to hear more about that, Liz, because I haven't encountered that at all. So be curious about what you mean by that. Scott Milligan is a genuine physical medium. Never heard of him, but that doesn't mean anything. One can sense spirit in the room when he works, and there is intelligence behind the okay, interesting. Okay, that's interesting. You know, again, the biggest problem we have is that we just, as researchers, we can't say much unless we're in total control of the environment with a physical medium. I mean, absolute control of the environment. And while there are Brazilian researchers at this point who are in fact building a setup like that for the physical mediums down in Brazil, so that they will be in total control of every element. And apparently the physical mediums in Brazil are okay with night shot. So that'll be really interesting to see, especially if they can produce any sort of physical phenomena and any sort of ectoplasm. And speaking back to something earlier in the show, Lapaka Kapanui just sent me a link to a post about his tour actually voted #1 in the nation. So I'll have to take a look at that in a little bit. All right. You know, one of the things about physical mediums is that we need some indication that there is spirit contact. And it's hard to know what's actually going on in the dark. It's hard to know. So if the information that's coming through is not evidential in some way that the medium couldn't have known, then we have very little to go on other than feelings. Okay, let's see. Do I know Pam Coronado? It's been many, many years since I've spoken to Pam. Pam is a really, really good remote viewer and a good teacher of remote viewing, from what I understand. So that's what I know about Pam. So I give her a lot of respect, essentially. Okay. Anybody else here? So let's go back to the mediumship thing. This coming weekend, I will be with a number of the mediums from the Forever Family Foundation. We're doing one of our 4 grief transformation retreats. We do that 4 places or 4 times a year in different places around the country for people who have lost a loved one. And so I'll be spending time with several of the mediums again this weekend coming up. These are evidential mediums. They have been tested, run through the ringer, certified. And my experience of them is really interesting in terms of how much specific information comes through that is not relevant to most people in the room. I mean, that's when we talk about faking readings, cold reading. When you're doing it for a group, it's really about, if you're evidential, it's really about finding the right person and giving very specific information, and not just factual information, but also information about the personality of the person, information about their behavior, things you wouldn't normally find. Okay, Robin's asking, are the TV shows helping or hurting the actual science? Well, as far as the science goes, the TV shows may be hurting in the sense that some of the funding sources may stay away from funding actual research because of what they assume about the field based on the TV shows. But I think that's about the only problem we have, because even the skeptics organizations have recognized, for the most part, there are exceptions in the skeptics world, who are really cynics and pseudo-skeptics. They're not really skeptics. But for the most part, they know that the ghost hunting world, the paranormal community, those TV shows have no bearing on parapsychology. And many of my colleagues, for years, I found that most of my colleagues weren't even aware that these shows existed or what was going on in that world, because there's so little connection. The shows rarely ever mention parapsychology. The shows rarely ever have parapsychologists involved. at all, not even as interview subjects. So it doesn't have that much of an impact. On the other hand, the positive is that they are bringing people into the paranormal who eventually discover parapsychology and get involved in the field. So that's a good thing. Have you ever known a hardcore skeptic who changed his or her mind? Um, about certain things. Not, and I wouldn't say that they changed their mind to where they became believers, but I'd say they changed their mind going from total disbelief to, oh, that sounds interesting. I've seen that with people who have really looked into the remote viewing research. I've seen it with, well, even, we have skeptics even within our community, even within parapsychology. I've seen it with people who suddenly find that there are certain things that are unexplainable that are worthy of explanation, even though they don't necessarily believe that it's psychic the way we think of it. I'm just thinking back to my late mentor and colleague Marcello Truzzi, who was a true skeptic, and he actually supported the work of psychic detectives because he'd seen so much of the value. He didn't necessarily believe they were psychic. He thought there was something else going on in their brains, which allowed them to pick up information, pick out things that the rest of us couldn't do. But he was definitely a supporter of that, of that particular thing. Do I think that skeptics like Michael Shermer and Sue Blackmore will ever change their minds? Well, I mean, Michael Shermer has kind of flip-flopped a little bit and been wishy-washy about his own experiences. I don't think he'll change his mind and support the field at all. And I don't know. I think Sue had too many negative experiences, her own with research. I think that if she had, for whatever reason, she was her own worst enemy as a researcher, as an experimenter, and I don't know that she'll ever change her mind completely in that sense. Garrett Modell, I know a bit about it. Not deeply into his work, but I think that it's definitely worth looking at and considering, given all the discussion about consciousness and everything that's out there. So I think worth looking at very clearly. Okay, Paul's mentioning Chris French. So Chris French is someone who's a graduate of the Kessler Unit of Parapsychology at the University of Edinburgh, was a total skeptic, like Richard Wiseman, but he has finally come out and supported parapsychology as a valid science. Not that he thinks we're necessarily coming to the right conclusions, but definitely is supportive of that. And I think to some extent, even Richard Wiseman's a little supportive of the field, but he's definitely not. He's more of a debunker and disbeliever in that sense. Let's see. But I know Chris French is definitely willing at having discussions, and he's definitely willing to look at evidence and really looking into things, certainly, and keeping an open mind. Have I ever changed my mind about a personal theory belief? Well, I didn't know. I was very agnostic about the existence of consciousness after death, ghosts, spirit existence, until I had a couple of cases back in the 80s, one in particular that completely convinced me that there just wasn't any other explanation. So interested in the ghostly stuff, but wasn't necessarily a believer in that sense. But that kind of shifted me. Had other cases since then that really support that belief from my own experience. Theoretically, in terms of theory, I'm not quite sure. I've kind of played with things a little bit. I have my own ideas about what goes on with ESP, but I try to keep an open mind for all of it. Let's see. Is there a location you've always wanted to investigate? Well, I don't know about investigate, but I really always wanted to visit Edinburgh Castle. That's one place. I can't think offhand of a place I've always really wanted to go to necessarily. Um, I really want to do the Whaley House Museum. I have somebody trying to work on that down in San Diego. I've heard that's very active, but I don't have any like priority list of for investigations. For me, the place has to have current witnesses, and so many of the locations that are ostensibly haunted. The witnesses right now are ghost hunters who have really possibly created their own phenomena. But I need to know that the activity is still happening, that it's real activity. It's not being brought in by the ghost hunters or created by the ghost hunters. I need to know more about that. So, off the top of my head, no. I know I have a list somewhere of places we recommended for some of the TV shows I've worked on, but haven't really. Don't keep that in mind off the top of my head. Mew, it's just impossible skeptics. Those are pseudo skeptics. That's true. Are there places where you would not go even if you had the chance? For example, Leslie Keene once said she would never go to. I have no reason to go to Skinwalker Ranch. I don't know that there's anything that fits what my expertise is. For Skinwalker, I mean, people could take me to a place where they can get Bigfoot all sorts of times. I'm not a Bigfoot hunter. And Skinwalker Ranch, the phenomena that's reported there, it's not ghostly. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit what I do when I'm my expertise for that. So that's the main reason. I think that there are some places I've seen in some of the TV shows. It's like I have no reason to go to a lot of places. No reason to go to the Amityville house. I have no reason to go to Lizzie Borden's house. I mean, there has to be active stuff happening. Otherwise, from a historical perspective, those places are interesting, but that's about it. Edinburgh Castle. All right. So Graveyard Grog, I've always wanted to investigate Stirling Castle. Hampton Court would be interesting. I know that that's kind of an interesting place in the UK. Edinburgh Castle is rich with history and aesthetics. The Ghosts and Ghouls tour. Yeah, I love to see the Edinburgh. Another place I'd love to go, but not for ghostly reasons, but for more historical and folklore reasons, is Dracula's Castle. So that would be kind of a cool place to go. All right. And Graveyard Grog, yes, it is more important to go to places where you're helping people, where people are actually experiencing something. I've been to Alcatraz a couple times. It's interesting historically, and you do feel stuff, but it's not like it doesn't have ghosts, doesn't have spirits around. The Hornet is really much better. Stanley Hotel, I've heard great things about that there is active phenomena there. So that might be a good place to go too. Let's see. Do you sometimes work with physicists to try to get a better understanding? Yes, I have a couple physicist friends. I have a colleague who's a physicist, and a couple of others who are in that. I do check things out with them. Have always done that where I could. In fact, in a couple of instances, I checked with a physicist who was a skeptic to make sure that I wasn't missing anything. I wanted to know what he thought about some of the things we were picking up with our environmental sensors. So I definitely do that. Good to see you here, Kelly. Okay. All right. You have a question waiting for tonight too. All right. So, well, Kelly, we have plenty of time. We got 25 minutes. So if you got a question, put it in there. All right. Are you going to dress up? What are you going to dress up for Halloween? So more than likely, I will be dressing up this year, something I did a couple of years ago, as the Shadow. As in, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men. That will be my costume this year. It's either going to be that or Ghostbuster again, but I'm going to be doing the Shadow this year. And I will be. A friend of mine has a small Halloween party, and that's where we go to. The other Halloween party I'm going to it has a tiki theme, so a Hawaiian theme, and actually she's going to try to raise support for the folks in Maui. So I'll just be wearing a really, really loud Hawaiian shirt. That's what I'm going to be doing for that. I think. What is the most impressive psychic feat you have ever witnessed? Wow. If you mean by a living psychic versus a ghost, Um, Impressive. Let me think for a second. That's really hard to say. I would have to say it's been some PK activity. Probably the most impressive stuff was some of the PK activity that Martin Caidin was able to do, which is written about in my book, Mind Over Matter, which he was able to continually do and taught me to do a little bit as well. As far as the ghostly phenomena, impressive is hard to say, but one of the coolest things that ever happened, there's a couple of really cool things that happened, I can say, at the Banta Inn. That was physical. One was my very first visit there. That's out in Tracy, California. This was the deceased bartender, owner, manager, was the most active, very, very active physically when I was there in the 80s. And my first visit was actually for a TV show called Hard Copy. And we were there at 11 o'clock, 11 something in the morning. And the director and the camera guy had their backs to the bar. I was seated away from the bar. The owner and the bartender were down at one end of the bar, and an ashtray behind the director's head popped up in the air about 3 feet, flipped over, was glass ashtray, and slapped back down on the bar without breaking. And the director and the camera guy, of course, heard it. They didn't see it. The camera was pointed in the wrong direction. I started laughing. The owner started laughing. The bartender started laughing. And the director said, was trying to figure out what was going on. At another time that I was at the Banta Inn, we were there for a couple of nights, actually, interviewing a lot of the witnesses. There were so many witnesses to physical activity there. And you can find clips about the Banta Inn on my other YouTube channel, which is simply youtube.com/Lloyd Auerbach. And so this one investigation, this one session, we did 2 nights. We were there after hours, but we started out early in the evening to start interviewing people to get their experiences down. And we were, myself and the few folks who were with me doing the interviewing investigation, we were in the restaurant area just probably around 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning. It was maybe closer to 4, but it was well after the place closed at 2. It was a weekend. And the psychic medium, Kathy Reardon, came running from the front. She was in the front bar area with Joan Borland, the owner, and one of the bartenders. And she said, "Come on, everybody come here." So we start walking out. I didn't know what was going on. Kathy takes us to the bar area. The jukebox is playing Spirits in the Material World by the Police. So I looked at her and said, "Yeah, that's very funny." She said, No, look behind the jukebox." And I looked down behind the jukebox, and I reached down and grabbed something, and I come back up, and I'm holding the cord, the power cord for the jukebox. Had no battery backup, by the way. It continued to play the song, and then when the song was over, the jukebox powered down, it powered off. So that was pretty impressive. All right, let's see here. What do you enjoy more, investigating homes or commercial? Many home cases are really, really interesting. If they are not afraid, if it's more of a curiosity, they want to know what's going on, that they want to communicate, I really enjoy those cases. I really, really do enjoy those cases. For the commercial public locations, it really depends on the location, its history, the witnesses, and what's going on. I will say, though, that I like haunted restaurants because I usually end up getting good food. So that's a good thing. Let's see. Kelly, how much do you find that animals can sense spirit activity of any kind? You have a cat who's being weirder than usual in the past 6 months. Okay. So it's really hard to know whether animals are reacting to something spiritual at all, unless the animal is behaving in reaction to the same way they react to the living person if the person is dead, and they're reacting the same way. So, for example, someone had told me that their dog was sensing their uncle, who had just passed away. I said, "Well, how do you know?" And they said, "Well, when my uncle used to come visit, the dog had very specific behaviors. Really loved him, just kind of circled around him and wagging his tail. Didn't do that with anybody else. Every once in a while, the dog is doing that, but there's nobody there." So that's a better indicator of there being your uncle's spirit being around. But when it comes right down to it, cats and dogs, especially cats. I've got cats. I've had cats for what, 40 years now? No, not quite 40, but close to it. And they do stare off into the distance. Hey, people do that too. They zone out. They sometimes hear things. They sometimes hear insects or high-pitched sounds or low-pitched sounds. They hear the sound of wiring in the walls. They hear stuff outside the house, and they will behave in odd ways, even though there's nothing that we can censor at all. And that's not paranormal at all. So the question is, what else makes you think there's a spirit there? If we're just relying on the animals, they can't talk to us. So unless they have behavior, like I said, that matches behavior they had with the person who was alive, who's now deceased, that's important. All right, so he does a lot of just staring up the corners. Thing where also reaches up with both arms and act like he's standing against legs. Interesting. That's interesting. Did he ever do that with, well, first of all, the standing up part, did he ever do that with human beings, living people at all? That's important. The ceiling, we had some noises on top that I barely could hear. It turned out to be something on the roof, believe it or not, turkeys, and making some scratching noise. The cats were the ones who alerted me to that. So that can happen as well. So there can be some actual noise up there. Hopefully you got nothing in your attic, that's no animals in your attic that are causing problems. Because sometimes they'll hear animals that are in places in the house that they probably shouldn't be. Not to say that this is not a spirit, but you can't go by that alone. All right, Paul, your friend believes Ouija boards are vulnerable. I've used Ouija board many times. So far, nothing bad has happened. And he thought, yeah, okay, Ouija boards, I have that on my list of things to talk about. If you do an EVP and you're worried about Ouija boards, you are in the same danger that you would be in if you did use a Ouija board, because you're trying to communicate with spirits, and that's what you're trying to do with the Ouija board, right? I think, the fact is that Ouija boards are not dangerous any more than anything else that you put negative thought into. So if you do anything at all where you're saying, I'm afraid I'm going to do this, but I'm afraid something bad's going to happen. Something bad's going to happen, potentially. The Ouija board planchette, the pointer, works off of what's called the ideomotor response. It's the same thing that happens when you use a pendulum, where a pendulum, in fact, I've got one right here somewhere, I think. All right, yeah. So do I have a pendulum here? No, not there. All right, so the idea is with a pendulum, you're actually holding a weight or something at the end of a string, and my pendulum seems to have disappeared, unfortunately. Anyway, I'll use a different pendulum. Here, let me show you. This will be a cool one. A friend of mine made this for me years ago. We like to call this the fickle finger of fate. So when I hold a pendulum, and I'm holding this at the end of this between my thumb and forefinger, and I think circle, even though I'm holding my hand perfectly still, it's rotating in a circle. Now, if I think back and forth, it starts moving back and forth. So that's called the ideomotor response. It's minor muscle impulses. It's done by the unconscious, even though I'm consciously directing it. It's still done by the unconscious. So you can use a pendulum. You can ask questions. You can ask yes or no questions. I mean, why use a flashlight? You might as well use a pendulum. So the Ouija board, the planchette, moves around very easily based on unconscious muscle movements. The problem with Ouija boards, or any spirit board whatsoever, or anything like that, is when you have more than one person on the board, on the planchette. You don't know who's moving it, and you don't know if somebody's moving it consciously or unconsciously. But either way, when you access the unconscious, fears come out. So teenagers, and that's where we get most of the negative stories, by the way, is from teenagers using Ouija boards or spirit boards or anything else. Teenagers are doing it, to contact evil spirits, to see if it's really demonic, to see if it really does everything they hear about in the movies. They're screwing around. And the odds are that somebody's unconscious or conscious mind is going to actually provide those negative reactions to things. But the Ouija board is just simply a printed board. That's all it is with a planchette. There's nothing at all mystical about it. It's patented. It was patented in the late 1800s. You can do the same thing with an upturned glass and a letter and number cards in a circle, and just keep your finger on that to move it around. That's where the Ouija board came from. There are many versions of the Ouija board. Actually, they actually put out a Barbie Ouija board years ago. There's a Stranger Things Ouija board you can buy. I have that one. I have a lot of them actually here in the house. You can buy an angel board, which supposedly contacts angels instead of spirits. You can. I've got something called the Psychic Circle, which has nothing to do with it. It's just all this bad folklore which comes from the religious fundamentalist grouping. So it's not bad, right? But it will access your unconscious, and that could possibly be a little screwy. Let's see here. Yeah, you can. So Kelly's back to the cat thing. Yeah. So all I can say is you need more of an indication that there's a spirit there before you make that assumption. One of my cats does kind of stand up on his hind legs a bit because he thinks he's going to get a treat, a special kind of treat. He actually looks like a meerkat when he does that. The other one jumps on my leg like you're talking about, but he never does. He does not do that otherwise. And he doesn't do it to my wife either. So we have to can't make an assumption like that, unfortunately. What do you think of alleged past life regression? Well, there's nothing alleged about it. Past life regression, whether or not there's an actual past life, it is an alleged past life, but the regression's real in the sense that people are actually in hypnosis. We in our field of parapsychology, doing research on reincarnation and investigation, do not put much stock at all in past life regression. However, past life regression therapy, where what's really going on is that past life may be an indicator of something going on in your unconscious or in your life. It's a story. It's very, very powerful therapy. It can be used that way. But the problem with past life regression, with adults especially, and even really don't do that with kids, is the fact that there's so much information in our heads we're not even aware is there, and there's no way to know that that's not coming out of that. There's also, in the rarest of past life regressions only, do you get information the person could not have known about a past life. Most of them have totally unprovable information, or often wrong information. In fact, a lot of the information seems to be, you can sometimes pin down to movies that the person may have seen years before. Let's see. Kelly, back to the cat. You might have something there, but again, I can't really comment about that. It's really hard to know with a single animal. Okay. And Kelly, you can always email stuff to me. Just simply ask profparanormal@gmail.com or profparanormal@gmail.com. The email is actually in the details of this channel, in fact. All right. The board's bad rap is also because of Hollywood. Absolutely. Hollywood has a lot to do with it. In fact, and I've mentioned this before on past episodes of this show, but also on Facebook, when I used to do it on Facebook, a friend of mine not a friend of mine, he's an acquaintance, is an author named Konstantinos. At a conference years ago, he was doing a whole lecture on the history of the Ouija board. It was a really great in-depth lecture on the history. And he mentioned he had gone to Catholic school. and he mentioned that they were playing with Ouija boards in Catholic school before the movie The Exorcist came out. He was in high school at that time. He said he even played it with a couple of priests and a couple of nuns. So they didn't think it was a terrible thing. But then The Exorcist movie came out, and the book had been out a long time. And all of a sudden there was a hue and cry in the general public against the Ouija board. And he said the word came down from on high to the school administrator and the priest there to lock away the Ouija boards. That was a reaction to the fear caused by the movie, The Exorcist. That's it. Does hypnosis fall under paranormal field? No, hypnosis falls under, if anything, psychology. I mean, it may be used in some instances as a tool. I have used work with a hypnotherapist in some of my cases to hypnotize one of the witnesses to be a medium to communicate with the spirit, the ghost that is ostensibly there. So that's possible. My late friend Pete Haviland actually, at my urging, became a hypnotherapist, and he used that in many of his cases as a way of kind of calming people down, but also to get more information out as well. But it started out as being studied by the Society for Psychical Research, but it was pulled out into the realm of psychology pretty quickly. Have you ever investigated dowsers? Not specifically. I've worked with a few dowsers over the years and known folks who have done research with dowsers. We're not sure whether there's a number of possibilities for a good dowser. It's certainly not the rods. The rods have nothing to do with anything except for the ideomotor response. I just meant to bring this back again, that those dowsing rods move in people's hands because of minor muscle impulses. When really good dowsers, most dowsers in the past used to use or have used a stick or something else, dowsing rods, to find water, mineral deposits, things like that. Water witching is an old tradition and very successful typically. And they always say the stick is indicating things. Well, yeah, it sort of is, but it's their hands unconsciously, they're picking something up. We don't know if this is a form of geomagnetic sense. So are people picking up the magnetic patterns of the earth, which indicate that there's water or something else there? Or is this a psychic thing? We don't really know which is which at this point. But it's a pretty interesting thing for sure. Liz, it's too long to write out here. Can't even paste the link. Okay. All right. Well, you know how to get a hold of me, so feel free to send that along. Be curious to see for that. All right, we're down to 5 minutes now. 5 minutes left. I'm going to repeat a couple of things that I started at the very beginning. Number one, go to parapsychology.org. That's the Parapsychology Foundation. And whatever you can do, and certainly go to their Facebook page and connect with the foundation. They could certainly use some help. Maybe we need to set up a Patreon thing for them to keep them going at this point. The other is the classes are coming up for the Ryan Education Center. They start on October 9th, that week. There's a number of classes listed on the website. And I will be teaching two. One is an advanced field investigations class. The other is paranormal case studies, which I do recommend for folks if you're interested in some really deep dives into some really cool cases. Jimmy Aiken is teaching an Introduction to Parapsychology course on Mondays. I highly recommend that if you're interested in this field and haven't taken any courses, that's a good one to start with. You can start with the case studies or one of the other courses that's being offered by the Rhine as well. Okay, let's see. And Paul, I may have missed something here. Any thoughts on? All right, I must have missed something here, Paul, on what you posted, because I'm not really seeing it in the chat, unless it's way up in somewhere up in the chat somewhere. Okay, and I'm seeing, I have access to two chats. Unfortunately, the scrolling on the screen is not as current as the other. or actually it's more, yeah, there's a lag. So I am missing some stuff. Liz, I can't even see your whole comment at this point, fortunately. Went by too fast. So I'll have to try to get that later on. All right. And thank you, Jimmy, for the comment on those classes. And Jimmy, I know you're going to do a great job on the intro course for us at the Rhine. Let's see. What do you think of Stephen Schwartz's work? Well, I think Stephen is doing a lot of things these days around consciousness studies, and I think Stephen's done some great work in the past. I really recommend his, connecting with his podcast. I think he's just started a podcast at this point. He's a really kind of forward thinker, and he's done some great work. I think his books are really good. Secret Vaults of Time, and he has a couple of other, the Alexandria Project, another one, both using remote viewing for archaeological work. Okay, here we go. Dr. Parnia says that disinhibition in the brain causes consciousness to expand at death. He thinks NDEs are real. Well, I mean, we think NDEs are real. Don't know the specifics of the neurology at this point, but that, NDEs are real. People are having those experiences, and there seem to be those experiences with really good information coming back through their out-of-body experiences during them. People do investigations to help people who think they are being haunted, but it is only try to help the ghosts. Yes, we do. So one of the points I should make is that when one has an investigation and it's clear that there's an apparition there and the people are afraid, the ghost may be stuck psychologically. They may be thinking they can't go anywhere else. We certainly hear from mediums and the witnesses sometimes that the ghost is saying they didn't know where to go to. They didn't see a light when they died, so they're stuck here. Everybody seems to think you're going to see the light like in the movies, but that's not always the case. So we do help them. So it is important to remember that your clients are not only the living, they are often the dead. And by the way, sometimes the ones who are dead are much more pleasant than the people who are alive. So just do keep that in mind as much as possible. You really do need to consider helping the folks who need help. And sometimes it's just simply a matter of getting them disconnected from their property and explaining. Sometimes it's just explaining what's going on. Sometimes it's giving them ideas like, hey, you can travel. It just really depends on what they actually need. And so I coach people when they are having an experience with a ghost, which we do in investigations as well. I coach them to ask the ghost questions like, who are you? Why are you here? And what do you need? In other words, what can we do for you? And it's really interesting when people follow through on that. Very often the ghost is so surprised they leave. They really shouldn't. They should provide some information, but in any event, it's an interesting process, and we've been able to help a number move on in that way. And others help them stick around and do other things. So NDE is the real question. If it persists after complete cellular death, how long or any limit? That's post-death experiences. It's the experience you have as a consciousness after death, after the cellular death of your brain, your body, the whole bit. And that's where we have to kind of rely on these apparition cases, mediumship, and things like that. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining this week. We will be back in 2 weeks on October 15th, and then again on October 29th, right before Halloween. Thanks very much, and I hope to see you all here. Please tell your friends. Subscribe. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe. But do tell your friends, spread the word. And let me know if you have any questions. All right. Take care, everybody.